Welcome to the Colbycast, episode 252. Thank you for joining us. Today, Bonnie and I are joined by author Cheryl Hughes to discuss Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen. A hugely impactful figure in the 20th century, Archbishop Sheen was an immensely popular figure on the radio and television. Cheryl, author of the new book, Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, Convert Maker, introduces us to this wonderful and holy man and the impact that his life had on the church. We definitely enjoyed getting to know the Archbishop better and think you will as well. We hope that you'll enjoy the show.
Hi there, I'm Bonnie, Colby homeschooling mom of 4 lads and lasses, liturgical musician, popcorn, and podcast fanatic.
And this is Stephen, homeschooling father of 5 and director of development for Colby Academy.
Stephen, when I say the name Archbishop Fulton Sheen, what comes to mind?
Mostly my stories from my wife's father. He would talk about Bishop Sheen and all of the things he had been doing in the 1900s, the 20th century. But also he showed up at the fundraising event for the start of Thomas Aquinas College. So back before they had opened their doors. And my father-in-law was a founder at Thomas Aquinas College. And so I've read his speech that he gave to these people who were, getting together. And there's this one really great anecdote which he talks about, which just makes me laugh every time I read it or hear it. And he said that at one point he was being heckled by somebody in the audience, basically, and he was asking, so was Jonah really in the belly of a whale for 3 days? And Archbishop Sheen says, I don't know. When I get to heaven, I'll ask him. And the person says, well, what if he's not in heaven? And then our Bishop Sheen says, well, then you ask him. And just that rapid, sort of clever, witty, I don't know. I can see why he was so loved by people and why he made such an impact in the last century.
That's great. I have, somehow, thank you. I have to say thanks to YouTube for offering to me a clip of Archbishop Sheen on the What's My Line show. And that the picture that's frozen is like him laughing. And that's the image that comes to mind when I think of him. So yeah, as listeners can probably tell by now, we're talking about Archbishop Fulton Sheen. And with us for that discussion is Dr. Cheryl Hughes. She's the author of a book recently published by Ignatius Press entitled Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, Convert Maker. Dr. Hughes, welcome to the Colbycast.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here.
I'm very excited to talk to you. It's been fun preparing for this episode. To get us going, would you tell us about yourself and your background?
Sure. I'm by training a historian. So I got a bachelor's and master's degree in history from Boston University, and eventually a PhD from Durham University in Durham, England, in historical theology. So, and the dissertation for that doctorate was the book I wrote on Catherine Drexel, St. Catherine Drexel. So that was the beginning of my publishing odyssey. And with those credentials, actually, I've taught everything from preschool to grad school, though a good 30 years of my career was teaching college and university. Mainly at Tulsa Community College. Okay. And there I taught in humanities and religious studies and history and film. And when you teach humanities, you teach everything. So, that was great. I love doing that. We live in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where we are now, my husband and I are both retired, and we have 3 children. All my children have doctorate degrees of one kind or another. And so we have 5 grandchildren.
Beautiful. And Catherine Drexel is significant to the Tulsa area for her contributions to the cathedral school that's there.
She founded that with $1,500. That was enough to build the school, a brick building, a 3-story brick building. And she came through here once a year to check on her the schools that she founded, as well as the schools that she funded. I always make a distinction between those she funded and those she founded, which means that she sent her own teachers, own sisters from the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament to teach there. So her sisters did not come to Tulsa for that. And I found out later, after I actually had already read the book, that she had also started a school after there was a race riot in Tulsa in 1921. That summer there had been race riots across, there was a huge one in St. Louis. Anyway, we had one here, and afterwards she established a school for African American students at St. Monica's, which was at that time, at the request of the congregation, an all-Black congregation. So Tulsa has the unique status of having had two uh, schools built for her purposes.
She's quite dear to the area. Yep.
Yeah, she is, and it's surprising how many people don't know of her.
Hmm.
Um, though when that book came out in the school here as a classical school, um, one of the parents bought a copy for all the teachers.
Oh, nice.
And many for the parents of the students who were there. So I had some nice talks about Catherine Drexel. Though now I'm on to Sheen. I'm all into all things Sheen.
Well, how'd you come to Archbishop Sheen? Why, of all the folks to write about next, why him and why now?
I really loved doing Catherine Drexel and her positio, the document they give for her canonization that gives her life story and all kinds of testimony about her, was the first written in English. And so I was looking around for another person to write about, and not a saint this time. I was thinking to write on Clare Booth Luce, who was married to Henry Luce, the owner of Time Inc.
Okay.
And they were the power couple in the 1940s and 50s. And she had, at a very low point in her life, converted to Catholicism by Fulton Sheen. And so I found that the time I was looking at Clare Booth Luce, somebody had just written a 2-volume biography on her, telling more about Clare Booth Luce than you'd ever really want to know, probably. But I was intrigued by her conversion under Sheen. And so I started looking at the sort of famous people that he had converted. And I was struck by that and really inspired by all those converts. My husband and I are both converts, so convert stories are sort of near and dear to my heart. And if he was the near occasion of conversion for many of those people, I wanted to know more about him. And I believe I might have seen him on television when I was very young, uh, like walking through the room or something. And my
Yeah.
father would be watching Life is Worth Living. So I really didn't have any concrete memory of him. I remember his interviews after he left Rochester, the one you were talking about on Firing Line or What's My Line. I mean, he just did it. He was such an interesting person and a Renaissance man. That was the other thing that drew me to him, was the fact that he had such a breadth and depth of knowledge in just nearly everything. He commented that he studied Einstein's theory of relativity for 100 hours.
Oh,
I mean, he wanted to really understand it. So he was keen on that.
I think that's one of the things that is appealing, especially for our Colby families, who many of the people and concepts that he references frequently, they are closely, they're recognizable to our Colby students, and they're very, you know, they're relevant to our family life today. And so I think that makes him very appealing and worth discussing here with for our Colby families. And we can talk more about that a little later on. But what's your process like for researching and writing once you have landed on, okay, Fulton Sheen, then what happens?
Well, partially in my background, I also have done a Chautauqua character. Do you all know what that is?
Tell us more about that.
Um, it's a traveling tent show that takes
Okay.
us from Chautauqua, New York, which in New York it was established like a summer adult education, summer Sunday school, but education on more than that.
Okay.
And so the local humanities, Oklahoma Humanities Foundation, gave a grant for the local Tulsa Arts and Humanities to put on these tent shows once a year. And we would have five scholars who became the first person presenters of their people. So that was very interesting. And what I liked about that was in researching that life, it was to use as many of her own words as possible to tell her story. And so that one of the things I did was I looked on this long list of people he had converted for those who had written autobiographies. Because again, I wanted to be able to tell their stories in as close to their own words and their own experience as possible. So that's how these people were selected. There were others that might have been, very good, but they hadn't written autobiographies, and these people all had. So I try to look for quotations that are going to be useful. Um, I'm afraid my professors from grad school would be all over me like a cheap suit if they saw what I did. I did not write 3x5 cards or the cards that you're supposed to write through and organize and everything. I think that's gone by the by. And I actually have a kind of a unique memory. I can remember where things are. And so I was just books all around me, all open. And I said, oh yeah, this quote over here I know is going to fit in this story at this point that I'm trying to tell about Fulton Sheen. So really, it was just trying to pull together a lot of threads in a way that made sense to me. So the book is actually chronological, but when you get to some of the converts that I go more into depth about, though there are lots of convert stories throughout the book, the ones that go into depth, like the one on Clare Boothe Luce or Fritz Kreisler, who was a composer, violinist of great note. I tell their stories over a course of years, and so it may go beyond actually, where I really am with Sheen at the time. So then I have to pick up Sheen and keep going. Anyway, but it's just, I think it's just circular and just keeps on going like that. It was fun. Every morning I really could hardly wait to get down and work. Really, it was a very easy process. I say that I actually I started into it and I had written maybe 15 pages in 2015, and then another project came along and that didn't get published until last February.
Yeah.
That was on Chinese women. So, back to the humanities, you do a lot of things.
Yeah.
So this is on Chinese women in literature, art, and film, all the things that I taught. So I was just the editor. I wrote one of the chapters, but I did the herding of the cats. And that took far longer than I thought it would take. And so as soon as that was off my desk, and I came back to Sheen and probably wrote it in about a year or so.
Okay. I don't think there's just there's a lot to that, bringing all that together. Yeah.
Well, I had started on it, several years before 2015, and it just came out this last November, December.
What an interesting time frame along in parallel with his canonization process, which we can come back. Let's talk about that here in a little bit. Do you have any standout moments or memories of this process?
Of the writing?
Yeah, bringing this book to us.
I will say that it was shocking to me, and it's really shouldn't be shocking to me, was how familiar Sheen was with the Virgin Mary. He had given her a challenge. He wanted a very specific sign. He wanted to know if he was going to be able to come back to Lourdes. He loved being in Lourdes. He really, really loved their faith, very close to the Virgin Mary. He had been dedicated to her as an infant, 4-day-old infant. He dedicated himself and his priesthood to her. And so he was over in Europe, and he was afraid once he got back across the pond that he would be ensconced in church affairs here and he would never get back. So he said, I want a sign that'll let me know that I'm going to come, I'll be back. And so he said, if you can imagine this, a little girl of 12 or about 12 wearing a white dress who will present me with a rose.
Well,
so he's there. He's been there for 9 days. He said, a novena. He's out of time now. It's after the place is closing. He stayed there all day because the sign wasn't there. And he's leaving and he says, you better hurry up, Mary. I'm almost there, Mary.
Oh,
So he's going towards the gate. It's getting dark, and here comes out of nowhere a little girl about 12, dressed in white, who presents him with flowers.
wow. What a
And
great story.
I was just so shocked at the familiarity.
Hmm.
I mean, I
Yeah.
realize that we should all be striving for such familiarity. Um, Catherine Drexel would say to be praying to Jesus, and she'd say, potatoes, Lord, we want potatoes. Sheen would say to Mary, I want this particular sign. And he asked for other signs as well, but that was the only one I know of that was so specific, that
It's,
was,
when you,
dramatic.
and the interesting thing is you're saying that is like he's familiar, but he also waits all day. Like he doesn't just get impatient and leave early or whatever. He waits until the last possible minute and
And
is,
so does Mary.
yeah.
I'm imagining her expression, hearing him address her that way. I can just,
Yeah,
yeah.
Lee had that kind of relationship with her.
Well, for our listeners who aren't familiar with Archbishop Sheen, or maybe the name is recognizable, but they don't know a whole lot about him, would you give us a few basic biographical details of him?
He was born in 1895 and lived until 1979. So that's his and that's why I like doing biography, by the way. They're
Yeah.
born and they die, and you just fill in what happened in between. So you've got a beginning date, and an end date. Um, he knew from a very early age that he wanted to be a priest, and he did not share that necessarily with his family. It was a very Catholic family. His mother and dad were the mother particularly was quite strong. The father was a convert, by the way, because the grandfather Sheen, when he came from Ireland, married a Protestant girl and became Protestant. And so the children they have, including the Sheen, who was the father to Fulton Sheen, was Protestant. Um, Married a Protestant girl. They had a child, a daughter, who was Protestant. And so he wanted a mother for his child. And so he married Sheen's mother, and she was Catholic. She said, well, I'll marry you, but you have to become Catholic. So they became Catholic. And the grandparents, the Protestant grandparents, filed a suit in federal law to take possession of the child, to take custody of the little Protestant girl. So Sheen had a half sister who was Protestant that he never saw. He was just completely dropped out of his life, which I thought was kind of interesting. It shows you how anti-Catholicism was still active in the early part of the country's life. This would have been in the 1800s, but nonetheless, that persisted for quite a long time. So Sheen finally went to college, high school and college, and there was a big conundrum about whether he would go directly into the seminary or whether he would go to get a PhD. He really wanted a PhD in philosophy. That was his main interest there. And so he was admitted with a complete total scholarship to a PhD program, as well as to the seminary. And one of his professors, his favorite professor, said, tear up the scholarship and go to the seminary. You'll do well. And he said, you might even get a better education than you ever thought you would. So after he was ordained, the bishop in his diocese sent him to the university, Catholic University to get his in Washington to get his PhD. Well, he was 2 years there, and then he went to Louvain in Belgium. And at the time, Louvain was the place for neo-Thomistic scholarship, and that was just perfect for him. He thoroughly enjoyed that. He wrote a very famous book. He was an outstanding student, as one might imagine. He was even asked to apply for an agrégé, which is a post-PhD degree in Belgium. I don't know if any other place really has it, but if you are, you have to be invited, you have to write an important book, and you have to pass a very difficult exam. So he went off to Rome to prepare for this and went back. He'd written his dissertation that later was published as a book, and it was very popular. Not popular with the scholastics, with the scholars. It's not for everyday reading. I don't know if I don't have it on my bedside table, I can tell you. So the agrégé meant that you were going to be aggregated to the Louvain faculty. So there he was, in his early 20s. He'd be a professor at this famous university. So at the same time, other Oxford wanted him to teach for them. Columbia in New York City wanted him to teach for them. So he wrote to his bishop and said, "Well, what do I do?" And the bishop said, "Come home." And he put him for only 8 months, into a inner city parish that was kind of dying on the vine, but he managed to completely bring it back up and brought newer people in, and there are lots of cute stories about that. So he was almost immediately asked to speak publicly at the National Shrine, the Basilica of Our Lady in Washington, D.C. And he was so popular that they kept asking him back, and he was having all kinds of requests to come all around. He was doing, while he was teaching, only 2 classes a semester. He eventually was invited by the Paulist Fathers to come up to New York City to give their Lenten retreats. And they were so popular that they had to put chairs outside in the street. And at one point, the Paulists had the radio come in and share some of those. So, but it was not until 1930 that he wound up on the radio, the Catholic Hour, and he did that for 20 some years. So the Catholic Hour was intended for the Catholic audience. In fact, the Paulists were part of that as well. It was the Council of Catholic Men who were the sponsors for that. And at first it was only in the sort of New York City area, but later it got very big. And partially he was not the whole show, though one would think it was the Sheen show. It was not. He spoke for maybe a half an hour, and he really wasn't even on every week, but he was definitely on most weeks, and he became the star of the show, and they really couldn't get along without him. So he ultimately then went from radio to television in the 1950s. By that time, he had been made the American director of the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, which is the arm of the Catholic Church that oversees foreign missions. And his job was to raise money. And he raised so much money that under his leadership, the entirety of the Catholic missions in the world, about 2/3 of them were funded by American Catholic dollars. So he's very, very successful. He had a very brief stint, went off the air after a fight with Bishop Spellman, and he became the ordinary in Rochester, New York. It was pretty much a disaster. He was trying to make it he wanted everything that he'd heard and learned about coming up to the present day in Vatican II. He wanted to do all of that right away in Rochester. And they had a bishop there who'd been there for, I don't know, more than 20 some years. So having a new bishop was change enough. But then he came in with all these Vatican II ideas. And there was social unrest, there was all kinds of things. So he really asked to get out of that after about 3 years. And he was past retirement, so it was fine, that he do that, but it was not a happy experience for him. And then he was, spent the rest of his life going on talk shows and giving retreats. He loved giving retreats to prisoners. He loved giving speeches anywhere and everywhere, right at the end of his life when John Paul II came. There was going to be this enormous mass at St. Patrick's in New York City. And Sheen was there, but he was off somewhere. He was kind of out of good graces with a few of the hierarchies. You can imagine all those egos together. And so the John Paul II walks in and he said, well, where's Fulton Sheen? And so Sheen came out and he fell to his knees before, and he was very frail. He's really just not many months away from his death. Fell to his knees, and the Pope sort of grabbed him and tried to pick him up and said he had been a good son of the church. He had spoken well about the Lord Jesus. So I think that was really a high point for him. It was a long and very productive life. He wrote, I couldn't imagine if we did a word count, it'd go to the moon and back for sure. It would be such a large number. He just spoke so often. He took up various causes. He was very much an American patriot. He loved the United States, thought everybody should love the United States. He was very hard on the communists, not on the communists per se, but on communism. He was always very clear to make a distinction between kind of the evil ideology and the personalities involved.
Yeah.
So that gives you a good spread of his life. He's just from one media kind to another, but always with the printed word in the background, always with the printed word.
I don't know if all of these are true, but with some of those things, like I'd heard that his show, the TV show that he did was going up against people like Frank Sinatra and things. And yet like he won an Emmy for
Right. He was the personality of the year. He was opposite his first run was what they would have referred to as the obituary slot because it was destined to be killed. And opposite that, he had Milton Berle and Frank Sinatra, and you have Sheen in the middle. And Sheen shone.
Yeah.
He was wonderful, and as you say, he got the Emmy for the best personality. Milton Berle, uh, his show was a family show, kind of a lot of different things went on in the Milton Berle show, almost like an old vaudeville show of sorts. And he referred to himself as Uncle Milty. So Sheen on occasion would call himself Uncle Fulty. And when he went to receive his Emmy award, he said, I'd like to thank my writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Right.
Other people are thanking their first grade teachers or their mothers or their directors or what have you, and he gets the evangelist. So,
it seems like it's infectious, his cleverness, his wittiness, but not like even in the quotation that I said at the beginning, it can be a little cutting, but not uncharitable, not mean-spirited. It's just clever and
right.
just so fun.
He was not mean-spirited, and he liked to start things off with some sort of joke. They were incredibly corny jokes, and there's a lot about joke psychology. If you're telling a corny joke, and often he would be the butt of his own joke. So I thought he did have humility, and actually it was something he had to studiously work at because he was so brilliant, of course, and succeeded at so many things. He was not wanting for ego, but on the other hand, he had to know his place as a servant of God. And so he was constantly reminding himself of that kind of thing. But if you tell a corny joke, there's two things are happening. Everybody laughs because you've told a joke, but and they know it's not really very funny. It's this sort of weird relationship that he was able to establish with his audience. There were people in the theater as he was taping the Life is Worth Living. And originally it was a question, is life worth living? And he said, oh, no, we're not doing that. Life is worth living. So he went on. One of the things that surprised people is how short he was. He was like 5'7". I'll say he was 5'8" on a proud day. But people who saw him on television thought he was this big person because he had such a big personality and such a commanding personality. But if you think about it, he's in a cassock, and cassocks have these buttons up the front. That is elongating, so it makes you look taller. The camera was a little low set looking up at him. So, if you're looking up at somebody, they must be taller than you are. Um, and he had his ferriola, this cape, this dramatic cape that he'd kind of swish around as he'd walked on the stage. That gave more bulk to him. So he looked like a much more physically substantial person than he really was. Um, and large, it's his personality that's so large, of course. But he had a presentation, a physical presentation to match that somehow, which I thought was, very clever of him. But when most people wanted him, most of the people he talked to before he went on the television, you should just wear your clerical suit with the Roman collar. And he said, "Well, I always wear my cassock, and when I speak at public events," he said, "I'll wear that." So I'm glad he stuck by that. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
glad he stuck by that.
I find him very relevant to my own life, to family life, to many of the topics that we study and people in literature and so forth that we are studying as Colby families. He's got this background in philosophy and scholarship, this high regard for Western civilization, and is deeply knowledgeable about ideas like communism and things that are still we still contend with today. So he remains very relevant. And I would love your thoughts on that yourself with your own background and what you know of Archbishop Sheen.
In his day when he was going to school, most people dropped out at the eighth grade. And so if you went on to high school, and if you were in a Catholic school, you got a classical education because that's what education was.
Yeah.
And so they got in there and started fussing about, oh, what about the child? And what about this? And what about that? And thank you, Mr. Dewey. You know, thing, education has changed. And it's sort of ironic, I think, that we have to now kind of reinvent classical education when that was the very thing it was from the beginning. So as I said earlier, he was a patriot. And partially this comes from Catholics, while very early in the 20th century became the most numerical of any Christian group. I think the whole of Protestantism had larger numbers than the Catholic Church, but certainly the Catholic Church had more numbers than the Baptist or the Methodist or the Presbyterians. So it was, a fairly significant religion, but it was very Catholics were not considered to be real Americans. They were sure that they somehow gave their allegiance to the Pope in Rome rather than the man in the White House. Um, and yet, I found that a third or more of the soldiers in both World War I and World War II were Catholics, when numerically, I mean, they were not that high in the whole population. So even that didn't do enough for them. So part of Sheen's undertaking, I think, was to make the Catholic Church less alien to the wider American population, that he could talk to them about, especially when he went on to television, he had to do programs that would be acceptable by people of all religions or none even. Um, And
Interesting.
so he talked about the kinds of things that we still worry about, teenagers. What do you do about teenagers? They think they're such nonconformists, but they're just a herd of independent thinkers all doing the same thing, wearing the same clothes, listening to the same music, using the same lingo that their parents don't use, because we're still saying cool, and they're onto something else altogether. So it's very timely he is, I think, to come out now. He was very concerned about secularism and how he called secularism a barnacle on the ship of democracy. And the thing with barnacles, if you don't scrape them off, they will ultimately rot the ship and it will sink. And so he thought that secularism was such a great evil because it opened the door to um, Nazism or fascism and communism. And, we can sort of go on veganism, vegetarianism, all these different things.
Yeah.
That all these things that kind of pop up here and there. And he really predicted, only I don't think he realized how prescient he was going to be for our, this late into the 21st century now. A quarter of the way in, by the way.
Right. Yeah.
So it's quite amazing that we still read and still can learn from Fulton Sheen. How dangerous it is to live in a society that has relegated God to the outside. And the real need to have, I think, personal witness to that.
Interesting. I'd read that he had participated in the Second Vatican Council, I believe, and had worked, and that Pope Benedict the 16th had later said that he had fond memories of working with him during that time. So,
And so did John Paul II.
and yeah,
Paul II, I'm glad you brought up Vatican II. He was the only prelate from the United States who was fluent in Latin. All the others had to get a Latinist to write their write their pieces for them. Whether there was going to be a written, what they called intervention, or a spoken intervention, they had to get a Latinist to translate their English into that. But he didn't, he could just speak it. That's how well educated he was in Latin. And I see that you have Latin teachers there at Colby. So this is all a good thing. Because he was with missions, so we're talking, this is the mid-60s. He's off of television, but he's still very concerned with the missions. And he thought that we shouldn't be dealing with mission territory. We should be dealing with the need wherever it is. John Paul II, a very young bishop from Krakow, told him they couldn't afford a seminary. And so Fulton Sheen said, why can't the missions pay for that? There's a real need. This would be a really good thing to do. So when he was at Vatican II, and he was there at every meeting, by the way, one of the few that stayed. I mean, he didn't stay the whole time because it went on forever years, but when they were in session, he would be there. And he also was part of the pre-planning as well as part of the post-planning of it. He paid for bishops from mission territories in Africa and Asia. He paid for their upkeep there in Rome. He paid for their hotel rooms, and he lived with them in the same pension or little hotel or convent or wherever it was they were staying. And it said that John Paul II, in learning English, partially learned English by listening to tapes of Fulton Sheen, which I thought was fascinating, just fascinating.
That's great.
John Paul II is one of my heroes. So to have him tied that closely and be that the letters that the two of them wrote back and forth were so beautiful. The friendship was so deep, and the faith in God was so profound in both of those people that you couldn't help but be moved by it.
I'm certainly seeing broad things which would lead to the huge number of conversions that came. I mean, you're talking about his love of the Blessed Mother, his devotion, and this relationship he has with the Blessed Mother, and then he's got this interest in spreading that in the missions, and then he's got this great intellectual formation, and he knows where things should be going, how to explain things clearly and simply, and just a love, again, that love for bringing this love he has to everybody else, which. So I'm guessing that probably is an underlying theme throughout many, if not all, of these conversion stories that you write about. Am I on to something, or is it?
Um,
Or is it
the other aspect of that is also extremely important, and we didn't touch on it yet. Is our adoration every day before the Blessed Sacrament. So he really was very Eucharistically sensitive and devoted in ways that so many other people, might not have been. So he had such a good rounding there. He says in one of his little essays that he wrote for a book on conversion, that really what you need are three things: kindness, kindness, kindness. Um, when you look at each of these converts, they're all different. They all kind of come in slightly differently. I think it's G.K. Chesterton said that the Catholic Church is like a great big building with hundreds of doors and no one enters by the same door. So, I mean, there are certain things you can say about the conversion. Almost all of them had to do with a crisis of some kind for an individual. Um, and it could be any number of things. It could be an illness. It could be, for Claire Booth Luce, it was the death of her daughter, uh, following not too far on the death of her mother and her father and her brother. And so, she was totally alone in the world. And Bishop Sheen was with her. They didn't know one another. They didn't know one another. And this lady was about to jump out a hotel window and kill herself. She had had four friends who had done exactly that. And somehow the Holy Spirit was with her. And so she called a priest that she knew. She was a congresswoman at the time, had been, she was into her second term. But a priest had been sending her letters, not asking for anything, just sort of making little points and just touching base with her. And so she called him at 2 a.m. and said that her soul was sick and endangered. And she apologized for the lateness. He said, "Don't worry. This was the prayer. This was the call we've all been praying for." And he said, "What you need, and the only person that can give it to you, is Fulton Sheen." And so Fulton Sheen called her and invited her to dinner at his apartment. He had a cook, so it was chaperoned. And uh, he said, "I'll talk for 5 minutes, and then you can ask all the questions you want to ask. No problem." And so he starts in giving his 5 minute spiel. And at some point he said that, God is all goodness. And I sort of imagine her jumping back and tossing the chair behind her saying, "Good? How can you call the God good? How could a good God have taken my daughter from me? How could that be? That is not good. That is not a good God." And he said many things, but at the end he said, "Your daughter has paid the price for your redemption."
Oh,
I mean, I can almost cry thinking about that. I mean, that's such a poignant moment. And, for a mother, I can't think of anything worse than losing one's children. And yet, um, here was Bishop Sheen pointing to the good that was going to come out of this. And she was not offended. Some people would be offended at that. But one of the things that I would say about Sheen was he was very intuitive about people, and he knew that he could say that to her, that she was tough enough, if you will, to take it. And she said, "I knew right then that this was the one and only man for me." And he spent weeks and weeks bringing her into the church. He gave her all kinds of philosophy books to read, and so eventually she came in, and she was a very good, stout Catholic that raised lots of money for Catholic causes. Was a friend of his right till the very end. He was having heart surgery, and she said, "Well, I don't see how the surgeons can even find a heart. He's been giving it away for so long."
oh.
But he was that kind of person. He really intuited people. I sort of think if you're not, if you happen to sit next to him on an airplane, at the end of the flight, if you're not Catholic, you just haven't been paying attention. He would have, rosaries on him that he would hand out to people and talk to them. He was coming back from Asia and talking to a stewardess. Now that's a pretty long flight across the Pacific Ocean, and telling her about the lepers and the leper colonies that he saw there, and he gave her a rosary, of course, probably blessed her. So lo and behold, some months later, she shows up at his office door and asks the secretary if she could see Bishop Sheen, and she comes in and she said, "I just thought you'd like to know that I've left the airlines. I'm joining a convent, and I'm going to become a missionary in Asia." I mean, just how did he know? I mean, just that one few hours. In fact, most people sleep flying across the ocean. So in between delivering drinks and doing whatever she had to do, she was picking up from him important signals that she internalized and became a nun and became a missionary nun at that. I mean, really just, they could do that to people.
It definitely brings to mind the allowing the Holy Spirit to work through you to say the words that need to be said. Just in a couple of your examples right there, that, I mean, how could you know that's the exact thing that somebody needs to hear at that moment? But again, with this love of our Lord, with the love of the Blessed Mother, I'm sure he was listening carefully to what was needed. But brilliant.
Yes, he was brilliant and very, as I say, intuitive. In his latter years, he really enjoyed giving retreats to nuns and priests and whatnot. He would not give retreats, by the way, to nuns that were not wearing a habit, a full habit. He just not going there. Also, he would not give a retreat to priests or seminarians if the Blessed Sacrament wasn't there and exposed. And they sometimes had to go down and get it down the hall because they didn't keep a tabernacle in the church anymore. This is sort of the silly nonsense that came out of Vatican II. But anyway, so he would say, you have to have this. But afterwards, say he was at a seminary, afterwards he would say to the proctor, the young man in the second row, I don't know, 2 or 3 in, I think he's going to be leaving soon. Now, how does he know that? But he just intuited that by the young man's questions, or maybe even there were no questions. It was just the way he attended to the retreat and seemed to react to it. So he just picked up those vibes
Wow. Amazing.
somehow.
So we are recording this in early March 2025. So it's Lent while we're recording this. So these ideas of conversion and even Eucharistic adoration, his devotion to that, I can see those tying in nicely with our Lenten theme. This isn't a conversation that, of course, is applicable any time of year, but it just happens, not just happens. It is happening during early Lent that we are recording this. Yeah. Yep. So where do things stand now with his cause for canonization?
Well, it's on the pause button as far as I can see.
Okay.
We were just almost down to the beatification. I mean, his cause had been accepted, opened, and a miracle had been attributed to him. You probably know about this. It was a baby who was stillborn, and after the birth, the doctors looked the baby over and said, "No hope for this child," and put him over somewhere, on a tabletop. And in the meantime, the mother and father are praying to Bishop Sheen for the baby. And after, I think it's like 61 minutes, the baby starts crying. So here he's not been breathing for a whole hour. The doctor said, "Oh, wow, we don't know how to account for that, but he's going to be multiply handicapped because, you need oxygen for your brain and it probably has killed part of his brain. So no, he's perfect to this day. He's perfect."
Amazing.
So there is a wonderful miracle that's been attributed to Fulton Sheen's intercession. They were getting down to the beatification, which is the next step before canonization. When they open your canonization, you're venerable. When you get beatified, you're blessed. But he didn't make it. Somehow, nearly at the 9th hour, somebody from Rochester Diocese made an accusation. Nobody knows exactly what it is, but it seemed to be perhaps having to deal with the sexual abuse and Sheen's reaction to it, or, had he done the right thing by whatever might have happened in Rochester 40 years ago. But of course, right away, it was investigated by the Vatican. It was investigated by the diocese in Peoria, is where the canonization is coming out of now, had moved from New York to Peoria, Illinois. They investigated it. The diocese in Rochester investigated it. They could turn up absolutely nothing that the bishop had done wrong, or even, hints of anything wrong. So it's on hold. I've spoken to a couple of bishops about this, and what they have said that Rome responds to the bishops' conference. So the USCCB, were they to press for it, it would happen more quickly. But what's happened in the intervening years is lots of dioceses have now lots of causes for all these different saints, would be saints, and there's just not as much traction. So I think he will be made a saint. I hope it's in my lifetime, and though that's getting towards its twilight, so I don't really know. I hope it comes forth because I think he's really, really deserving, and I think he's so unique in that because of his notoriety, because of his television program, because of his radio program, because of all the things that he wrote, the whole country was his parish, if you will. Actually, he said with the missions, the whole world was his parish. But and I think not to downplay any of the missions. I mean, obviously he did really, really amazing, wonderful things. So he should be a saint. He meets all the criteria, or else he wouldn't have gotten this far. But I don't know how many saints' causes are out there on pause. I just have no idea.
Sure.
Certainly, in your coming to our podcast, for me, it kind of brought back to mind Bishop Sheen, and then especially reading about the miracle. Even if the beatification process takes time, we know that and by your book, the conversions, we know that his prayers, his intercessions are effective. So, and that stood out to me, and the fact that he's in Peoria. When I drive to visit my mother, I'm in Arkansas, she's in Wisconsin, I drive through Peoria. So when I saw it's part of this that his body is there, it's like I need to stop and pray,
Yeah.
ask for his intercession. That's what I need to do. So I will do that as soon as I can.
Next trip. Yep.
Yeah. I think one of the things that you come away with is that he was absolutely fearless in preaching the gospel to individuals, people sitting next to him on airplanes or buses or train cars or, wherever they are. He was always out there promoting the Lord, promoting salvation to people who need it. And I think that we all need to take that up. Not that I'm going to be jumping on somebody to come, but it takes more than a good example. It takes this is pray and sometimes use words. I think in the case of converts, it needs words. I mean, I think you need to present yourself in a way, or the church in a way that's attractive and welcoming. But then I think you need to step up and make the invitation. Have you ever thought about being Catholic? Have you ever thought about, come to Mass, whatever, however you might possibly do it. Now, not everybody can do that. But maybe a lot of people can. And just remember Fulton Sheen. I think he's a great intercessor.
It makes me think, just like, most of us aren't called to do exactly what Mother Teresa did as far as getting down in the gutters and doing that. They're spending your entire life doing that. But if you come across somebody in the gutter who needs someone to get down there with them, we're all called as Catholics to do that. And so, like what you're saying about clearly Bishop Sheen had this calling to speak to the world in the way that he brought about good that most of us wouldn't be able to accomplish if we set out to try to do that. But we might be their only chance to hear about our Lord and about the faith. And so that is a calling that we all have, no matter how, I don't find it easy to do, but I think you're right that we have to take that seriously.
Well, I think after reading about Fulton Sheen and his doing that, I think it seems more possible somehow to me. Just seeing kind of how casual he was. You mentioned Lent and how well he fits into Lent. And in fact, I started out the book, and my own introduction is that his was a Lenten life. He was constantly doing penance. He even wore a hair shirt at some point. I don't know how often or what it was like, but he admitted that to a dinner party. And that was just a very short little quote I picked up out of the Positio. And this man was interviewed and said he'd been at a dinner party, and he said he had worn the hair shirt. I thought, wow, okay. He's almsgiving. He gave away almost $200 million of his own money. He could have been a very, very wealthy, spoiled, difficult person, but he gave it all away. And, just because he wins an Emmy and he hobnobs with, say, the royalty of Belgium, which he did. I think he was the godfather to their children, some of their children perform marriages for their children. So he knows royalty of Europe. He knows Hollywood royalty, if you want to call them that. But he was also there for a young man from Long Island whose family had thrown him out because he had Hansen's disease and he was terribly disfigured. He was a leper. And so Sheen took him in, fed him several times a week, would cut up his meat and feed it to him, finally got an apartment for him and furnished it and paid for it. I mean, you don't hear that. You think of him as cavorting with the, I don't know, the bright ones, the glitterati of society. And yet he would help everybody. So it wasn't, he's high and he's low. It's everybody, because everybody was a child of God. Everybody. His nephew makes a comment about walking across a hotel lobby, and people are just stuffing money into his pockets. And he gets outside, and the first beggar he sees, he gives money away and keeps giving money away. Twice he gave away the coat off his back. It was cold, and there was a young priest who didn't have a heavy coat. And he said, "Here, take this one. This is like his cashmere or camel's hair coat or something." Gave it to him. He said, "I have another one." And then he got home and his secretary said, "No, you don't have another one. You have to buy one." So, he did that twice. At any rate, it's a beautiful life. It's honestly a beautiful life, and somebody who's such a privilege to spend time with. So I hope people will read the book.
Certainly well worth the time spent reading the book and getting to know him. It has been a real pleasure visiting with you, Dr. Hughes. We will have a link to your book in our show notes, along with links to things that came up as we were talking today. So listeners can head there for more information about you and how to find the book. Thank you for coming to visit with us today, and hope you'll come back and visit with us again.
Thank you so very much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Subscribe to the Colbycast on your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss an episode. And let us know how we're doing by leaving a rating or a review. And as always, feel free to email us at podcast@colby.org.
Mary, our Mother, pray for us. St. Maximilian Kolbe, St. Ignatius of Loyola, holy saints and angels, pray for us. Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam.